All right, welcome once again to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight on your brain. Last time, whenever that was, we teased talking nutrition because we tend to talk fitness stuff because I pretend I know what I'm doing and he knows what he's doing when it comes to this stuff. And I had some people ask me recently. Actually, I was talking to a potential new client when I was getting stabbed in the neck, and she asked if I do nutrition and all that stuff because we were talking about training. And I said I try and keep it as simple as possible, which is don't eat the crap you know you're not supposed to eat. Which is always my baseline. That's where I start. I don't know where you start when you start talking nutrition to people, but that's always my baseline because I tell them dieting and nutrition, it's not easy, but it is simple because most of us know the basics. We just don't always follow it because it's tasty.
Yeah. I'm going to have to preface this with being in the state of Texas. I cannot give diet and nutritional specific advice to someone who has a medical condition. And if you do have a medical condition, please consult your doctor first. Anything else, we can give general guidance and tell you what the research says and what's worked for me and my clients. Other than that, consult your physician and you're at your own risk.
Yeah. My the nutrition certifications I did as part of my personal training certifications were
Mean nothing, by
basically
the way.
they do mean nothing
From a
and
legal standpoint. That's why I gave that disclaimer, because in the state of Texas, those
yeah.
are the things that you can actually sue your trainer for.
Mhm.
And if actually people knew what they could sue their trainers for, my industry would clean up really fast. So anybody who heard that and you got
Yeah.
a really strict diet plan that gave you metabolic syndrome or something, go after them, because I want y'all to clean it up,
Yeah.
because I want to be the rare person.
Well, I did a couple, and the really lame one, the one I keep in my presentation folder to show people how easy it is to be a certified personal trainer and just get some piece of crap off the internet. That one, like, tried to pretend that it was teaching you to be a nutritionist, and it didn't give you all the disclaimers. The good one I got specifically said you need to know this so you know to refer someone to a specialist. So this isn't so it's talking about so like when it was talking about different vitamin deficiency symptoms, it made it clear that we're telling you this so you can recognize and not diagnose it yourself, but recognize that someone might need to see a specialist about this.
Yeah. And it's the same thing, same way with therapy. If someone says they're doing rehab with
Mm,
you, then they're overstepping their bounds. Now they may know a lot about it and you may trust them, but they cannot charge you for it. They can't
right.
do an ACL evaluation on your knee, for example. Uh, I do preventative evaluations, like this will put you at a higher risk for such and such injury, and I can help you with the injury prevention standpoint. But when it comes to actually treating an injury, by law, if you are prescribed PT, I have to wait till you either
Mm,
completely deny it and just come to me for training, and hopefully I do what I need to do, or you're released from a physical therapist. So again, knowing where the boundaries are, and I listen to a lot of the lawyer podcasts, and they always preface it with, this is not legal advice, blah 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 blah, even though it is their field. So I was actually curious about that. When it comes to training, do we need to say this is not training advice, this is just our experience? uh,
mm.
but I am actually a training expert. So where is that line with fitness training? And there's really no specific line there. But with
Yeah.
nutrition, I know where the line is. And so I had to give that disclaimer. And if we say anything from an injury standpoint, there is a line where we are not diagnosing nor treating injury. And
Yeah.
if you do have a nutritional need based on a special condition, go to a registered dietitian or your physician. I would recommend your physician first. Uh, I would look for, if you were talking about advice, a registered dietitian that understands fitness as well. because there is a huge gap between a lot of the research that is only on sedentary, obese individuals versus people who are actually trying to make a difference with their body.
Mhm.
But all that aside, that's our disclaimer.
Yeah. Well, as a rule, I think any advice you're getting online should be a guideline. It's like using Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a source, but it can be a guide to give you an idea of what you're looking into and thinking about and where to go for legitimate sources, right?
Well, and this was a struggle for me too, going to the online realm, because eventually I need to more fully adapt to it, because that's just the direction the world is going. And I work 9 to 11 sessions a day. So for those that can do the math, that's 9 to 11 hours of actually being in front of client, which translates to about 11 to 13 hours of actual work or time on the floor. And so I've maxed out my income, because you really can't work a whole lot more than that. So if I want to do anything more than I'm already doing, I need to start transitioning to something that I can reproduce to more people in mass. And I had to make a mental switch, because I work because of the more right brain side of my mind that I have. It's more of a pattern language. It's adaptable. It's always transitioning. It's not quite chaos, but it's not a list of demands with specific timetables or structure. And so it's more like boxing. When someone comes in, or when you're in a boxing match, you have your list of combos and you have your basics all memorized, but everything is adaptable to that moment. And the group classes are a little different, because you can't account for everybody all at once. And really, your boot camps and your like your high school strength and conditioning coaches, your college strength and conditioning coaches, they can't account for all those little details. But I can, because I work on a 1 to 4 person at a time basis. And so anybody can walk in the room at any time with any issue, and I can make it through the session, because I've got all these combos that I've practiced over and over and over and over again, and I can just keep switching and adapting to the situation. That doesn't translate very well to online.
Yeah.
So it's akin to the difference between baking and cooking. Baking is an exact recipe that if you don't do it right, your souffle falls flat, right? Or your bread comes out hard or something, and you don't know till the end product comes out. But cooking, you can sit there and taste it and adapt and keep moving and see how it's coming out. So when you look at a chef, they have to take that mental disconnect and say, this is a basic recipe. People are going to need a little bit less of this, a little bit more of that, depending on their taste. But this is the median. And that's what I had to start doing with training. So I'm working on some stuff right now, because
that's a good segue back to talking about nutrition and dieting, because a lot of people, if you're first starting to learn how to cook and you don't have a foundation, use a recipe, use a recipe, use a recipe, use a recipe. And eventually you get to where you figure out how to wing it. You figure out how to substitute. If you're not, if you haven't studied the biochemistry, or if you haven't studied the biomechanics on the exercising side of it, just follow a recipe, follow a trusted recipe. And then eventually you should get to where you're able to wing it. Like you can, much better than I, just kind of look at a plate of food and give a pretty good guesstimate of how many calories that is and what the macro split is. Just because you know that stuff so much better than I do. And I have to kind of, if I'm going to guesstimate, I always go lower, because I'm not as good as that, or I have to, pull out the phone and start typing things in and figuring stuff up and trying to be more accurate if I'm gonna count calories.
Well, I'll expand on that when I go into my very few rules of nutrition. I don't know how you wanted to start this, but I wanted to go.
Just start it there. Let's get into the rules of your few rules of nutrition.
Well, first of all, diets in general, when we talk about weight loss, they all work.
You mentioned that last time.
Yeah, and Miller et al. Has a nice meta-analysis where over 6 to 12 months time, the difference between all the most popular diets was about 2 pounds. And that's not a whole lot. It's really, what do you adhere to? So
Yeah.
we need to stop fighting over high carb, low carb, no carb, low fat, organic, only shakes, no shakes, and all these things, on and on and on. So we've got kind of 3 things that are universal. For weight loss, you have to have energy restriction. I mean, no shit, right? So you have to have less calories than you're actually burning. And then we need awareness of what we're eating. So things like food tracking. If your program does not include that, you probably have a gimmicky, low resolution program. And then adherence. So can you stick with it? So if you can't stick with it, why even bother? So the big problem is extremes are very sexy. So the diet industry has been throwing extremes at us with gimmicks on it that just sell the ticket to the show. And if they're all going to work the same, you have a secondary problem with those extremes, is you're sacrificing something else. The old Thomas Sowell, there is only trade-offs. There's not, nothing for free. So whether it's Atkins or keto, they'll tout fat oxidation, insulin sensitivity numbers. Mediterranean or DASH will throw cholesterol numbers in your face, and they're both true. Any good writer can take the positives and write a nice book with a lot of good points. And then you add calorie restriction and boom, weight loss happens. And one of your good health markers has improved.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so like Atkins specifically, I know because I've read the book like way back when it first came out. And something to keep in mind, using that as an example, is a lot of these fad diets, for lack of a better word, come about from a specific place. Dr. Atkins was specifically trying to address obesity and type 2 diabetes, okay, especially in older Americans. That is what he was, that was his area of expertise and what he was specifically trying to address. Now that system had benefits for other people, but when you're looking at the program as he originally wrote it, keep in mind that was his focus. So same thing with a lot of these other diets. As I understand it, was it keto or paleo came about from addressing something like not celiacs, but something like that.
Celiacs, that would be paleo. Rob
Paleo.
Wolf.
Okay.
Paleo Solution, Rob Wolf. I would have it, but I have 2 other books up.
Right. So keep in mind a lot of these niche fad diets that are very restrictive on one thing or another. It's because they're trying to address an exception. They're trying to address a special population.
In the case of Rob Wolf, that he's also projecting his own illness onto everybody who is going onto the diet.
And that's where I was going next. Is I learned the hard way when to just shut up when it comes to dieting, because people get very militant about this. A CrossFitter, an atheist, and a vegan walks into a bar. How do you know? Because they tell you. So especially,
which do they talk about first? That's the question.
Yes. So
also add A&M grad.
And I've Texas joke for you people. Especially vegetarian and veganism, because I've found a number of people, just anecdotally, that switch to that because of an illness. One of them being cancer.
Which is go ahead and make your point. Because
so either they switch to it because they think that lifestyle gave them cancer, or they think and not without some validation that switching to this more restrictive diet is going to help them get through the cancer treatment. And if that's the case, you kind of just have to shut up, because you're not going to give someone like that empirical evidence and change their mind.
Yeah, but this is where I can't keep my mouth shut. Did I bring up the China study in another podcast?
Which China study?
The one where they studied cancer in meat consumption.
I remember you did, but refresh my memory and everybody else's too.
Okay,
But
so the China study. This is the vegan Bible right here. It was obviously a study done in China where they compared an all vegetarian diet in mice. This is in mice or rats. I can't remember, mice or rats. I'm wanting to say mice. All vegetarian diet, a high protein diet using casein protein, which would be one of the byproducts of milk for those that don't know, and then an omnivore diet. So they had a control, and they exposed these same mice to a known carcinogen to basically induce a cancer response. And then the conclusion showed that the omnivore diet had exactly the right amount of death that they expected, cancer and death. The high protein diet had the highest rate of cancer, and the high animal protein diet had the highest rate of cancer, and the no animal protein, the all vegetarian diet, had the lowest incidence of cancer. So they published this paper, and it was widely accepted as wow, meat causes cancer, or animal protein causes cancer. And some scientists decided to dig a little further into it. This is why we say read the methods and all of that. So if you just read the abstract and the conclusion, you say, "Wow, shoot, animal protein and cancer, they go together." But what they didn't tell you was that the all vegetarian diet group did not get cancer because they died of the carcinogen before they could develop cancer. So the carcinogen itself killed them because they weren't hardy enough to handle the diet. Now, above all, I'd make a side point. The omnivore diet was the best because they're mice and they're omnivores, and that was the best. But at the same time, the animal protein created a situation where they were hardier to handle the carcinogen long enough to develop cancer, and so someone that was part of that review decided to repeat it, and they used primates. I'm wanting to say it's chimpanzees. Primates, they used a lower dose of carcinogen to not kill their subjects, and then they did the exact same thing, and it was the exact opposite result. So something a little closer to our diet specifications, something a little closer to our DNA, and using a carcinogen where it wouldn't kill the subjects, and they probably would have reported it as well, unlike the other studies. So it's bad science. It really is.
Yeah.
But this is the basis for this. But then we look at the current data on meat. You see nitrates and nitrites cause colon cancer. You see red meat causes higher incidence of cancer. But if you really break it down, burnt red meat causes higher incidence of cancer because the burnt meat is a carcinogen, not the meat itself. The nitrates and nitrites, this is a statistical misrepresentation because they'll say increases your chance of colon cancer by 3%, which sounds like a big number. 3 out of 100 is big because that probability resets every time a cell reproduces, right?
Especially when you're talking something as horrible as ass cancer.
Yeah, exactly. And typically late diagnosed as ass cancer.
Yeah.
But if you know about statistical reporting, that's 3% of your original chance to get colon cancer, which was like in an adult male, I think it's 1.5 something or whatever. So it's now 1.53% versus 1.50. So that increase of 3% was to your original chance, which if I'm thinking about having my bacon and it increases my chances by 3% total absolute number, I might reconsider. But if it changes my chances by 0.03% absolute number, you know what? I'm going to enjoy that bacon.
Right. Because clearly this study was by communists who didn't want you to have your hot dog while watching baseball.
No, it was probably from sponsored by a company that sold nitrate-free bacon or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Follow the money,
Imagine that.
man. Follow the money.
Well, and that leads into my few rules, which I kind of developed because I live in an area with a large and growing South and East Asian population. So there are a lot of vegetarians because of Buddhism or Hinduism or other cultural factors.
Mhm.
And so I frequently would get asked, well, what do you think of vegetarianism? And so my first response was, well, are you thinking about vegetarianism for moral or religious reasons? Because that's none of my business,
Mhm.
right? So if you're a vegetarian because of your religion, none of my business. If you're a vegetarian because you're just a big animal lover and you just hate the idea, I can understand that. I'm a big animal lover. I I'm trying to resist the urge to get more of them because we have enough in this house as it is. But I get that, even though I still eat the tasty animals and sometimes shoot them myself. So that's none of my business. But if you're doing it for health reasons, okay, well now let me give you my opinion. And my basic take on vegetarianism and especially veganism is really the reason I don't like it is because it just makes it harder to have a well-rounded diet because you're cutting out a huge chunk of potential nutrients. Now, you can, and you told me this, I didn't realize, and this is rather new. For anyone who doesn't know, there are 8 essential amino acids, and they're called essential because your body can't make them.
Mhm.
So the other amino acids, your body can take bits and pieces and make them. The 8 essential ones, your body cannot. And for a long time, the only way to get all of those amino acids was to eat animal protein. Now, relatively recently, there are
All
supplements
in one source.
all in one source.
Yes.
So
You got to be precise there. Yeah.
yeah. Now, more recently, with more research and I think the big one is some algae sources, isn't that where they discovered some of these essential amino acids, and that's where a lot of the vegan and vegetarian supplements come from, is some
Yeah,
algae
there's some of that
sources.
pea protein,
Yeah.
soy, though that has other down the road implications.
Yep.
Uh, but also, societies that have been more vegetarian leaning for a long time, or even societies that are agricultural, and so they couldn't eat meat all the time, but they had a lot of vegetarian meals. They inherently mixed and matched things properly, and that had to be an
Yeah.
evolutionary process over time because we did these things, we lived longer, and the families that did those survived and passed down the recipes. So there are, don't discount culture in the whole thing, because science
That's a good point.
sometimes
Yeah.
develops. Red beans and rice works, as well as a lot of Indian dishes, especially because you see with
Mhm.
the lack of ability to eat beef in their culture, and pork was not accessible for a long time because of the parasitic issues along with that. So we got a lot of these cultures that developed over time to do it right without looking under a microscope.
But for most Americans, when you think of the typical Western or American, especially diet, you suddenly cut out meat and you've cut out a big chunk of your diet, and you're going to end up getting pretty repetitive and restrictive if you just
Mhm.
completely cut it out. So
Well,
if you're not
especially
doing
since
it,
when you're talking about prep time, the
Yeah.
vegetable component is the most time intensive part usually of your meal, because it has to be relatively fresh. Whereas I can smoke a brisket, which you say, oh, that takes a long time, but then I can eat that brisket for a week straight. Whereas if I do that with, steaming some broccoli, it's not quite the same as time goes on.
Mhm. So the point I was trying to get at is what you were saying about the mice. We're omnivores. Okay. So along with don't eat the crap you're not supposed to eat, and don't overeat is eat a variety. Over the week, try and eat protein from a number of different sources, try and eat a number of different types of vegetables, and try and limit limit your grains and your carbohydrates and your sugars. Easy peasy. Well, simple, not easy, but simple.
Well, haven't gone into my rules yet. So I was just kind of giving some
Oh,
background. But one of the beefs I had when I was developing this was most of your diets, when it comes to like your zone diets or your calculating your macros, they start from the calorie and then work backwards.
yes.
And so they say, okay, you're someone my size, my activity level, be about 3,000 to 3,300 calories a day. And then they say, okay, you need 20% protein, 20% fat, 60% carbohydrates, depending on the diet, or 30% protein. And so they all had their different percentages, but they started with the calorie and they worked at the percentages. But that didn't make any sense to me because your protein and your fat are building blocks. So if I say, okay, so I need to be in a calorie deficit because I want to lose 10 pounds and I go down to 2,700 calories, well, because it's a percentage, my protein reduced and my fat reduced. And then the carbohydrates reduced. So everything reduced, even though I still am training and I'm still breaking down my body every day and having to rebuild it with those protein and fat building blocks. So I was like, why are we reducing everything when we go on a diet instead of addressing it from the bottom up? So it was, that was my other beef with the whole program, was when you do it from the top down, you end up changing the things you need along with the things you want. And that didn't make any sense to me. So what I do is from the bottom up approach. So here's what you need for as far as protein for the day. Here's what you need as far as fat, because those are the things that are going to keep your body productive. So those are the building blocks. Those are the foundational pieces. But I also wanted to make it as simple as possible. I want it to be simple. We kind of looked at the research for the building blocks, and I do like where Brett Contreras is, because it was kind of where I was. The 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Yeah, there's a lot that says you can have less, but there's also a lot that says you can't overdo it by a little bit. So why not go a little over? It also makes it easy to calculate, because if you say I'm 180 pounds, oh, I need 180 grams of protein. I wanted as much freedom as possible. I wanted to account for as many health markers as possible. And I wanted something that helps you repair your body from intense training, because chances are, if you're going and starting a new program and you're doing it right, everything is intense for your body, whether it's walking because you haven't done anything, or you're going to a CrossFit gym and puking every day. So I need something that's going to help repair you for that. And also I wanted you to have something that allows you to live in the real world, because we can't be sitting there with our Tupperware at Thanksgiving dinner because we're not going to eat with the family. So those were all kind of considerations going into it. But let's get to the rules.
So for anyone who doesn't quite follow that, if you've ever looked at or been given diet advice, usually where you start is a number of calories times your body weight. So depending on what you're looking at, a lot of them will be 10 calories. If you want to lose weight, 10 calories per pound of body weight. I've always thought that's way too low, and that's probably why a lot of people can't stick with the diet.
Yeah, that would put me at
too restrictive.
1,880 grams or calories per day. God, I'd be emaciated.
Yeah, I've seen even in textbooks, I've seen that, and I've always gone, that's way too low. I'd rather start
or the infamous 1,200 calories a day. You see that a lot.
Yes.
1,200. Nobody knows where that freaking number came from, except everybody loses weight on it because everybody in this world needs more than 1,200 calories a day.
Right. And then traditionally, you take that. Okay, so I need to lose weight, so I'm 200 pounds right now, so I'm going to do 2,000 calories, 10 times 200. All right, well, now I need X% of fat, X% of protein, X% of carbohydrates. And what Sam is saying is that's backwards because
though that X% would lower your amount of
Mhm.
the things you need as well as the things you want.
Because a critical part of my overall health needs to be my exercise program, and
Mhm.
that is going to be breaking down and rebuilding muscle, which requires protein and also requires fat, because fat is an integral part of your hormone production,
Well, yeah,
among other
think of it
things.
like finances. So uh, if you have your bills for the month, things like your car payment, your house payment, these solid things that you have equity in would be your protein. All these basic things that you need to have that this structure you exist in, and then the things that make it run. The things that make it run would be your fat. So that'd be your utility payments, your internet, your phone, all the things that make that solid part of your life run. And then everything after that, that's your free money.
Yes.
Uh, and I use the word free money, but I'm going to go into a little bit of why don't be too free with that money. But the first rule on my very few rules is track your food, at least for a little while. And this is what you were talking about earlier, where I can look at a plate and say, kind of give you an estimate, whereas you would have a harder time. Is because I spent a long time tracking my food.
Yes.
So you just learn it. I can pick up something and say it's about this much, or I can look at a chicken breast and say that's 2 servings, because I've measured them for so long that I can do it intuitively now. Now track your food long enough to be able to do that, at least in general. Meet your protein and fat minimums, because like we said, they're the building blocks. In fact, not only are you going to not break down, but all the processes that help you burn fat or live a better life happen through those things. Like you said, the hormones. If your hormone profile gets thrown off, you can throw yourself in a metabolic syndrome quickly. If you're not getting enough protein, you could start losing muscle mass and not repairing from your workouts. And not only is it not only could you could atrophy muscle, but you're not going to perform as well. If you go into a workout a week later from some stimulus and you're still recovering from that stimulus a week before, you're not going to perform very well the next time. Whereas if you gave yourself the proper nutrients, you'd be able to perform better and do more good work. Now, a little side note on the protein and fat. I want to take stress out of your daily nutrition.
Yeah.
If you're a little short one day, go a little extra the next day. If you're a little high one day, we'll talk about the play calories, but you can go a little low the next day. It's about averages. If over the course of a week you're averaging the right amount, we're good. And then the last point is, like I said earlier, we're going to put a caveat on the free money. Don't eat like an ass. 80-20 rule, 4 out of 5 meals, do something good. If your weight loss in the illustration I have here, I said 80-20 for it, but really 90-10 if you're really in a weight loss goal. The people trying to gain can get away with some more. But your fun money, don't spend all your fun money on chocolate fudge or something along those lines. Though I will have to put an asterisk on that. I tested this by 2 months of only animal protein and fat and alcohol for 2 months. And my deadlift went up 30 pounds while I lost 12 pounds. So again, do not take this as advice and then come sue me later. But I was just playing around and it actually worked. So
yeah, well, it's like whatever that professor, Kansas or Kansas State, who just ate
the Twinkies, yeah,
the Twinkies and Doritos, but made sure to track very precisely his caloric intake and caloric output. And he repeatedly said, "Don't do this. I'm just trying to show that this is how this mechanism works."
Well, let me add to that asterisk now. because I had my protein and fat numbers, my body stayed together
Yes.
and was able to keep improving. And energy is energy at the end of the day. And you can't convert alcohol to fat directly, but it still is used as an energy source, a very high energy source, actually.
Well,
But
and here's the asterisk asterisk.
my liver's probably not thanking me. That's the asterisk. So there was probably a negative health effect to it, but with the performance and weight numbers, it still worked.
Well, and this leads into one of the rants I've been meaning to give for a while about nutrition, which is there are no superfoods. Food is food. There are no superfoods. Okay. If you eat, if you think, okay, well, I've got my fat and my protein, so all of my extra calories are going to be dark chocolate covered pomegranates because that's a superfood. If you eat 10,000 calories of dark chocolate pomegranates, you're still going to be, my 1,000-pound life. Okay.
Well, but I think
And
you missed something though, is as I still have a total calorie number.
yeah.
I
No,
just
but
don't start there.
my concern with if you're too free with your free calories, it makes it a lot easier to go over, especially if you're indulging in things that you have a weakness for, right? So that's one of my concerns with those kind of things. I had another thought too, and I forgot what it was.
Superfoods, olives.
Okay. So that's another reason to be careful with those free calories is to not, if there's something you overindulge in, to be very careful with how often, or try and eat that as infrequently as possible.
Yeah, well, we call them trap foods.
Yeah.
Things like dried fruit, like you just brought up with pomegranates, is as a trap food because it's something inherently good for you, but at the same time, it's easily overdone.
Yeah. Oh,
because it's very condensed sugar.
Yeah. It's how people get this idea that diet colas make you gain weight. No, it's the fact that people who drink diet soda overeat other things because it's easy to think, oh, well, I'm having a Diet Coke, so I'm going to go ahead and supersize this meal.
That's a good example of the limit of a retrospective cohort study, because you've got that variable with yourself. And the other one is people who drink Diet Colas are usually trying to lose weight. So they're already fat. And so you're looking at a retrospective cohort study that just basically interviews people and gets the information. Yeah, I drink Diet Colas and I'm, 37 BMI. But I'm trying to lose weight, so that's why I'm drinking Diet Colas. But doesn't come out in the study.
Exactly.
So there is no mechanism in the Diet Cola that causes the weight gain.
And this goes back to your first point, which is track your calories. And I tell people, I make sure to emphasize to people every single thing that goes in your mouth, because it's so easy for people not to consider the liquid calories they're ingesting and just how much of a daily dose that is, especially with people's coffee habits now with, freaking Starbucks and all of its copycats. That's a lot of sugary and fatty when you start dumping in the milk.
I think
liquid calorie
macchiato, whatever, is like
blah blah blah
calories.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like,
so if you're on the 1,200 calorie diet, you can only have one of
how
those.
much coffee do you drink? What do you put in it? Track that, and you will be surprised at how much. So if you're tracking those building blocks, that protein and that fat, and then you think, oh, well, I'm good, so I'll just eat this and I'll just eat a little of it. You better actually count it, especially to begin with, so you know how easy it is to go over with certain things.
Well, and one thing about the 1 gram per pound of body weight is protein in it itself is very satiating. And fat is satiating. Carbohydrates have a hormonal response to make you want to eat more a lot of the time. So if you really focus on getting those first 2 numbers, you'll be surprised about how not hungry you are.
Yeah. It's where the joke about Chinese food comes from.
Yeah. If you're someone my size or bigger, you find it hard to get all your protein in, and you're fighting to get all that in, and you're full. Which is, when you're dieting, full is like the best thing you can be. So if you really focus on those 2 numbers, it almost makes everything else fall in place. Now with the tracking, one of the biggest things that throws people off is they think they got to track the rest of their lives. Track long enough to get it down and then revisit it every once in a while.
Yes.
So
It-
I do a month a year. I do a month a
Okay.
year where I track what I'm doing because I have to kind of refresh my portions and everything. Because
Mhm.
it's just like drinking. You pour drinks stronger the more you drink alcohol. So you got to come back. Oh, maybe I got to start measuring those ounces out again. Uh, but yeah, it's a lifelong process, but it's not a shackle. It's not something that's gonna hold you down. And plus, once you reach your goals, maintenance is a lot easier than losing. So
That's 1 month a year. That's a good advice. Cause I usually tell people if you plateau, if you stop losing, then go back to tracking because you're probably overeating and not realizing it. But it just makes me think that a good time to do that for most people would probably be January. Cause it's after the holidays, everybody's making New Year's resolutions that they're not going to keep. But if you make a New Year's resolution to just track your calories through January rigorously, then that should put you on a good footing through the rest of the year.
my goal with all my clients is to get where I am. And after about 2 years, never have to make a fitness New Year's resolution again. Unless it's an achievement goal versus a weight loss goal or something like that. So, maybe it's I want to deadlift 500 pounds. Okay. So that's different than I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to get back to this clothing size or something along those lines. I want to just feel comfortable wearing a bathing suit this summer. Those are completely different than some really high mark achievement goal. But other than that, yeah, I want all my clients to make New Year's resolutions that help other people at some point. I want to give more to charity. I want to spend more time with my children or something along those lines versus I want to lose 20 pounds again.
Right.
Again, we're doing it again. So,
Well, that segues into racism.
oh, I can segue it into racism, I think.
I don't remember how. I had a way that I was going to segue. Probably I was going to bring up fried chicken or something. I don't know.
Michael Pollan, who does a lot on food, who does a lot on what we put into our body and also drugs and psychedelics and everything. He's actually quite an interesting person to listen to if you want to look him up. Pollan. And he said something. He was talking social issues, but also when it comes to the environment and everything else going on. And he actually segued this from food, and I thought it was just perfect. Before we even talked about this episode, and he said that one of the basic problems that we have when it comes to environmental health and the tribalism in our nature is our ability to objectify. And as humans, we can objectify the environment. And as we just talked, that potato is calories, carbohydrates, potassium, and all these things. That's objectifying the potato when it's really just something grown in the ground that we need to adjust to be a healthier individual because we eat things like that, right? Well, we objectify people exactly the same way. And that's where tribalism comes in. Does that make
No, that is good because this is where I was going. What brought this up, and I'd mentioned this to you, I don't think you watched it, is there's a documentary, and it's based on a book by the same title. There's a series on Netflix called High on the Hog. And the subtitle is something like how African American cuisine changed America or something like that. And
okay?
I was worried about it at first because you can kind of guess from the subtitle that this is something that would be very easy to turn into woke nonsense very quickly. And I haven't finished it yet. I've just gotten through the second episode over this week, and I haven't had time to go back to it because it's making me think too much. And I was like, I'm having to take too many notes, and I need something I can just turn my brain off for. But the first episode was actually astoundingly insightful and uh, surprisingly so, because so often in the story of Black America, we start here. Um, and so you lose a big part of the story there, and so he starts in Benin, which is a small country on the west coast of Africa. For anyone who doesn't know their geography, that kind of right angle there on Africa, it's on that southwestern coast. And the reason they start there is because a lot of Black Americans can trace their ancestral roots back there. Not just to those peoples, but because at the time there was a large African empire there that, like so many empires of old, was based heavily on slavery. And they made no bones about it. So that it wasn't, let's blame Whitey. They made a point that these were people preying on other people because they had the power to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, white Europeans were evil in the way that they abused Black people in order to get free labor, but they were buying them from Black Africans because that's the way life has always been for the overwhelming majority of all of recorded and pre-recorded history. If you had the
history,
and even current history, if you had the power to subjugate someone, you did, because you could. And it was in that way incredibly powerful. But the food part of it was, yeah, this is a guy, I'm drawing a blank on his name, who was a chef and a food writer and blogger, and that's how he got into it. And so part of why he went back there was to trace the roots of Black American cuisine to where it came from. So for instance, okra is prolific through the American South, and that is an African plant that came from Africa. Same thing with a lot of other plants that were brought over. And so he's tracing these back, and he's commenting on how how familiar all of these exotic things are, because he could very easily see, oh, this this spicy stew here is much like the stuff we make at home. This is this fried fish reminds me of the after church fried fish dinners we would have. And one of the first things to pop in my head, because he was, and I feel like he was very earnest here. He wasn't making the annoying social justice warrior woke point. He very earnestly and honestly believe this is a uniquely Black thing. And the first thing to pop into my head is, this guy needs a white trash sidekick, because I know that food. That's the same food you and me grew up with, just being poor white trash in the South. This is, and especially anyone who had grandparents who grew up in the Great Depression in the South, which was uniquely horrific compared to what it was in the North, simply because of it was already an impoverished area. So much of Black cuisine is the same as white Southern cuisine, because that's what poor people ate. Because unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of Black people in the South were poor, so they ate poor food. Well, all the white poor people ate the same thing. And this is where my brain started turning in weird ways, is that there's this bizarre parallel I realized between Black Southerners and white Southerners, because they basically lived after the Confederacy they basically lived the same lives as far as poverty, rural cuisine, even churches, the integral part of the church in their communities, and yet they had no idea or didn't care how similar their lives were because they had become so tribal. And obviously, the poor dumb white trash Southerner, you can very easily see where he's going to become tribal because it makes you feel better. It
Mm.
empowers you to kind of subjugate and think of yourself as better. I think I mentioned this when I at one point when I was talking about Dr. Thomas Sowell talking in the Robert Bork hearings that the big problem with literacy tests for voting is because dumb white trash guy walks up and can't spell his own name, but here you go, you passed, you can vote. Dr. Sowell walks up and he's written 100 books and it doesn't matter, somehow he failed. Because if you're dumb white trash, it makes you feel better to be able to say, well, at least I'm not that colored person,
Mhm. Well, and
right?
add a second dimension to it. They're also your competition for work.
And they're exactly, which let's not go off on a tangent, but that's where most minimum wage laws come from.
Mhm.
So you can see that, but let's also not that while there's more weight there for how whites treated blacks, it also went the other way. Um, oh, I just had a brain fart on his name. His nickname was the Hutch. He was a Dallas Cowboy in the 70s and I think a little bit into the 80s. Um, I think he also played for some other teams, but I remember him from the Cowboys, and that he would call in.
Of course you
He was
would, because you have no taste.
exactly. I hate myself. I'm a self-loathing Cowboys fan. Um, Also because he would call into Rush Limbaugh. He's friends with Rush Limbaugh, and he would call into him periodically, and they talk football together. Um, but I didn't know all of his backstory until I was listening to an interview with him, and he hated white people. I mean, hated them. Literally, the reason he got into football is so he could hurt white people. He got into football later in life. It was in high school, and he was a big, strong guy. And as he said, as he related it, he said to someone, "Wait, you mean if I play football, I can hurt that white guy? Sign me up." And that's how he got into football. He hated Dr. King because he thought he was a wuss and he didn't want anything to do with that nonviolence crap. Okay. So it went the other way as well for obvious reasons. Why wouldn't it? When you become that tribal, then animosity is logical. And yet, just by looking at their cuisine, just at looking at what we think of as Southern food, as soul food, as comfort food that has spread from the South all across America, so much of that is poor people food because it's tasty. Because you had to take this subpar stuff and try and make it as tasty as possible because that's all you had. That was your comfort, is
Mhm.
because you didn't have the other niceties of life. And so you know I as a wee lad who was raised colorblind, I was always confused by things like the jokes about fried chicken and watermelon because that's what I ate and it was delicious. I don't know. I don't get it. Why is that a joke? It's yummy.
Yeah. Uh, I'm with you on the fried chicken. That's one of my own guilty pleasures. We got a Popeyes right here, and I'll hit up a 24 piece but maybe once a month. But and that's why I don't have a six pack, but whatever. It's still delicious. Uh, but no, yeah, you're absolutely right. We can go across all cultures. We don't even have to talk about black, white, and talk about the cuisine of the poor person has become the luxury of the current cuisine market. Fajitas are a great example. fajitas at skirt steak was the trash meat, and the poor Hispanic, poor Mexican uh, workers basically figured out how to make it really freaking good.
Oh yeah.
And now you pay more for fajitas than you do for the actual more expensive cuts of meat than you would anywhere
Yeah.
else.
You mentioned brisket earlier. That's another one of those
Brisket, yeah.
subpar cuts.
Well, and what they figured out is, you get a bad cut of meat, just cook it longer. Just cook it longer, and then you add things like the barbecue sauce, the rubs to add all the flavor. You didn't need to do that with a good cut of meat. You just add a
Yeah.
little salt and pepper, and you got a steak.
Yeah.
But if you got a brisket, you've got to marinate it. You've got to put the rub on it. You've got to cook it for a long time with a
Yeah.
lot of care.
Well, and there's a reason that the iconic places for that kind of food are places that were traditionally very poor, and not just black poor, but white poor as well. One of the things that jumped out at me when I was watching High on the Hog is as he was talking about some of this coastal African cuisine and talking about how uniquely black it was. I'm like, dude, you're a chef. Have you never been to New Orleans?
Mhm.
So much of that black cuisine is also Cajun cuisine. It was made very similarly by the poor white Cajuns in that area, because that's what they had to do in New Orleans. Memphis and Kansas City are the big barbecue places, which had large, especially black, but also white poor populations.
Well, let me maybe throw out something a little controversial here, because then we can talk about the welfare state a little bit. Is when we're talking about what the cuisine we're talking about, we're talking 100 years ago, 200 years ago, uh, and poor people were left to their own to do the best with what they had.
Mhm.
Uh, and what you had was a situation where the work ethic was was at an all-time high, where affluence created laziness to some degree, uh, to a large degree, I would say.
Mhm.
And so you're affluent, you don't need to go out of your way to get something kind of nice. So if you, again, we'll go back to the sirloin steak. The nice cut of meat was something you would eat, throw a little salt and pepper, done. Okay. But you got a brisket, it doesn't work the same way. If you
Yeah.
try to cook a brisket like a steak, you're going to get a piece of leather. Uh, and so you combine that with the ingenuity and work ethic of someone who had to work for everything they've ever had, and you're gonna get a better product. Whereas nowadays we've kind of flipped the switch, where we pay more. You have to pay more for those things. Whereas if you are not affluent, you're basically what's the word I'm searching for? Enabled, enabled to just do things differently. Get fast food, for instance,
Mhm.
which is not healthy, not productive in any way. So, but it's a difference in times.
Yeah. Well, and the other thought I had when I was watching this is, and what do you miss out on? So we're talking about food and cuisine. What do you miss out on by just going through the KFC drive-through rather than you know cooking your own, and how much better it tastes, but also then what that means for your family, that family time, and also imparting that knowledge. You know, we learned how to cook because we cooked as kids.
Mhm.
We helped get dinner ready as kids and teenagers. That was part of what we did. You know, with our parents or for our parents. And if you're just going through the KFC drive-through, what are you missing out on there? And that was one of my thoughts of where my bizarre brain tripped over to, of how much did people miss out on by by tribalizing themselves when there were so many similarities between their two cultures and so geographically close. I mean, the poor black side of town and the poor white side of town weren't that far apart. I mean, the saying wrong side of the railroad tracks comes, you know, from that basically. So on this side of the railroad tracks, you had the poor black people. On this side of the railroad tracks, you had the poor white people. So, I mean, they're right there, and yet they might as well be thousands of miles apart
Well,
because of how they were psychologically and mentally.
to bring this into the political realm, it's kind of the difference between the establishment movement and the populist movement. And we've got one on both the left and the right. You got the Bernie movement on the left, which was a populist movement, which was actually a very uniting movement. I don't like some of the conclusions, but it was a very uniting movement for the people. It was a black and white work together, unite against the elites. Trumpism was similar, because that's why he got such a high percentage of the black vote compared to other Republican candidates, because he was a populist. You know, a lot of people like to say he was a nationalist, but he was a populist. Now, he did have some nationalist tendencies, but that was for the good of the working class. Whether he had ulterior motives, whatever, we won't go down that road. But the difference between the populist movement versus the Bushes and the Obamas and the current Bidens, when he's actually talking like he used to,
what? Huh? Who?
It was uniting. And so we've got a situation, like you said, what did we miss out on? Well, you missed out on more representation from the people up versus from the top down. And the jury's out on which one was better, really.
So another analogy I like to use, and something I thought of while I was watching High on the Hog, is I love baseball. And one of my bucket list things is to someday, the next time I get up towards Kansas City, is to go to the Negro League Hall of Fame, which is in Kansas City. And so you're a communist, so you wouldn't know the answer to this question, but I was talking to my uncle this week while I was visiting family, and I've asked this question because he's a big baseball nut, and I've been thinking for a while, who's the greatest baseball player of all time? And one of the things that got me thinking about this was years ago, having a long conversation with a mutual friend of ours who is adamant that it's Babe Ruth, because he says that if the hardest thing to do in sports is hit a baseball, Babe Ruth was the best at that. But then the second hardest thing has to be throwing a baseball. And if you see a pitcher who has a bad day, you understand that, because like Derek Holland said, he was once, after a bad game, he was throwing beach balls, because to a major league hitter, that's what it looks like if you're just a little bit off. And Babe Ruth would have been a Hall of Famer just from his pitching career, even if he hadn't started hitting. Josh, you're wrong, because there's more to baseball than just pitching and hitting. So my criteria is you have to have been great at multiple aspects of the game: fielding, hitting, running the bases, all that. And so my contention is it's Honus Wagner.
Okay. You've lost me because I'm a commie. Yeah.
Exactly. Most people won't know that name unless you know, for some bizarre reason, that at one point he had the most valuable baseball card ever. And it wasn't actually for his baseball playing. It was because he was devoutly religious. And back in the day, you didn't get bubble gum with your baseball cards. You got chewing tobacco. So he didn't want his playing cards sold with chewing tobacco. So there are very few of them. But he was one of the greatest baseball players in what's called the dead ball era. And that was back when they would literally spit on the ball and grind it up. And there were basically no rules in making a mess of the ball until somebody literally got killed by a pitch. So it was really hard to hit. And that's why there's a stark divide between Babe Ruth and everyone who came before. But he was a great baseball player. And one of the ways I can support my argument is because he played a World Series against one of the other greatest of all time in his own era, and he outplayed Ty Cobb. He outplayed Ty Cobb in the World Series, and the Pirates won that World Series. But you can't know for sure. And as you get farther along in the era, especially into the 20s when the Negro League started and you had some great players in the Negro League, you can't know for sure. We'll never know. People who, love baseball and love to argue about baseball, there's this stark divide because the joy of the game was stolen from posterity because people who otherwise should have been united. I mean, it's a freaking game. You should have been able to be united for the love of this game. And instead, it became something like cuisine that was completely tribal. Even though you look at, if you look at the success of the Negro League and its cultural impact, and it is completely analogous to the cultural impact and the success of Major League Baseball. And yet we can't cross these streams. So Josh Gibson was widely considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest hitter of his era. He died in 1947, relatively young. He was a catcher. I think he played for the Monarchs, and we'll never know just how great a hitter he was because even though he faced some great pitching, like he was contemporary with Satchel Paige, even though he faced some great pitching in the Negro League, there were some great pitchers in Major League Baseball that he never faced, and vice versa. With people always talk about, well, Babe Ruth never had to face Satchel Paige and all that. And if you, as I say, if you look at these people, it boggles the mind almost unless you know about anything about human psychology and human history and about how harshly tribal we can become even when it defies all logic.
From a developmental standpoint, it doesn't defy all logic.
Well,
it's
I would contend that it defies all logic, but it is rational from a human development and human history standpoint. It is completely rational because I
will
contend
make the
there's a
statement
difference.
that the negative direction we're going with it right now
Yes,
defies all logic, but the developmental process does not, and it doesn't make it right.
Mhm.
It doesn't make it just, but it does make sense, and those are completely different things.
Right.
Whereas the direction we're going now is not making sense and creating more injustice and less morally right. So that's when it stops making sense, was when we've transcended something that was slightly natural but not right, and then all of a sudden we start going the other direction. When you've seen the city on the hill and then started walking back down the hill, that's when it doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And so think with my analogy of baseball, look at where we've come from and why would you want to go back there? So for instance, my dad's answer to my question of greatest ever is Willie Mays. My uncle's is Pete Rose. Well, you can have a really good argument about that because both of those individuals played against the best of their era because there was no more Negro League, there was no more racial barrier. So this game, America's pastime, had finally become really America's pastime, not America's pastime over here, and then this league gets to be America's pastime if you're this color, right?
Well,
so why are we going back there?
Well, why would you want to go back there is
Yeah.
not the right question.
Okay.
Because nobody does. Very few people do. But some people can benefit from it. And when we talk about who are the sheep and who are the free thinkers and who are the leaders. Well, just really think deeply on societies and just social interaction in general. If everybody was the free thinker, we would have never created these large nations, because everybody would be constantly fighting, because they're
steady states.
yeah, we would stay in steady states, and it would have always been constant infighting. With If everybody's a leader, everybody's going to want to be the leader. So there has to be more followers than leaders if you're going to have a large society, and that's just the way things played out. Uh, if you're going to have 330 million people in a country, you have to have a select few that fight it out versus everybody all the time. The problem is when you get people in power that have figured out that they can create their niche, their center of power by driving such and such group of people against another group of people and creating that tribalism all over again. Now, the people that are in those tribes, because of whatever brain structure, uh, psychological characteristics they have, they're basically very low capacity to differentiate between that being right or what you're talking about being right. And it's the natural inclination to go tribal. So if you've got someone who can create their own status in society, controlling this group of people, then it's going to happen. And that's why we keep going back in this other direction. And the other part is there's very little capability of those people at the bottom to transcend that influence. So it's not a matter of do we convince everybody in the country of a certain thing. It's a matter of we've got to find the right leaders that can create their best interest by our best interest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's that's something that kind of jumped out to me in the second episode of High on the Hog, where it starts to lean more woke, but it's not preachy or in your face, because I don't know what category you would put this guy in, but he's not one of those, he's not one of those leaders. I he's not one of those who's using the wokeness to game the system. I really think he honestly and earnestly believes in what he's saying, and that thinks that he's coming from a good place, even though some of the stuff he says is segregating people more, when he's sitting here talking about the dangers of how we segregate ourselves. And I think there are a lot of people that get caught up in that, because as we've talked about, it appeals to our inner nature, as some people like to call it, our lizard brain.
Well, we can go to literature. You look at tribes that have no internet or any technology, no phones or anything. Their first instinct when they meet somebody from another tribe within their border is the best course of action is to bludgeon them to death. And it doesn't matter anything else about that individual person. They're of a different tribe and they're on my territory. There was a test they did where they fooled one group of people into seeing a certain amount of dots and another group of people into seeing a different amount of dots. And automatically these people segregated into who saw what set of dots and started arguing with the other side over which was the correct answer.
Stupid dress from however many years ago that was.
The blue and black or whatever.
Or whatever it was, yeah.
I'm glad I'm colorblind, so.
Well, but this is the uniqueness of America that we have talked about with, and I'll use our food analogy here, because you kind of mentioned it before. I was at a Tex-Mex place in Oklahoma, and I was looking through the menu, and I asked the owner manager dude there if they had. I jokingly asked him, "Do you have any barbacoa, or do you have too many gringos here?" And he laughed and he said, "Oh, we used to have it, but we don't have it anymore. Uh, Freaking beef prices have gotten so that there's a lot of things that aren't on their menu anymore." So we got to talking food. Because his family comes from generations past, comes from northern Mexico, which is where a lot of Tex-Mex comes from because of the influence into Texas from peoples that lived in northern Mexico. And so to us, we're perfectly comfortable with the Texican being part of our tribe. We're
Mhm.
perfectly comfortable. For anyone who doesn't know, uh, of authentic barbacoa is a cow's head.
Mhm.
It is the head and neck of a cow that you bury and you cook forever. Because again, back to this is the offest of offcuts. Okay, and you got to figure out how to
And
not waste that meat.
it's so tender,
Yeah.
so flavorful, and so greasy. It is the perfect driving home from the bar food.
Yes.
It is the best.
And there's
I
uh
mean, Ubering home from the bar. I don't
yes,
drive home from the
exactly.
bar anymore. Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Um, there's a place in, is it Arondos? Where is it? It's one of those, it's a small chain there in Houston where I sometimes stop on my way home from your place because um I kind of like living in the North Dallas area. I don't
Is it
like
right
how we're
off 45 by the
yes.
airport? Oh yeah.
It's near the airport. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
And they have barbacoa. So that's why a lot of times I'll stop there and get like 12 tacos. Uh, to take home with me because you can't get the good stuff up here. By good stuff, I mean, we went to high school in South Texas, and that's where the good stuff is. Um, and so, but that's uniquely America. Thomas Sowell has written exhaustively about the stark, sometimes violent divide between Indonesians and ethnic Chinese who live in Indonesia. And to Whitey, you look at a lot of those people just physically, and we wouldn't necessarily notice the difference. And you would think that after generations they would live together, but that's not how life works. That's not how most of the world has or still works. But in America, you can, and you talked about this with the way they and we can get into this some more now about the way people fudge racial science and statistical numbers. You'd mentioned the study where you just look at someone briefly and
Mhm.
say whether they're trustworthy or not. And oh no, white people automatically think black people aren't trustworthy. Well, that number goes away if you're someone who lives and works around an ethnic mix, right? So
Implicit bias test is what you're saying.
yes,
The
the implicit
IATs,
bias
yeah.
test. Yeah, those go away if you're used to somebody because that is uniquely American. That where we went to high school, it was like half white people and half Hispanic and like one black guy.
Well, you brought up sports and you brought up tribalism, and we talk about
Mhm.
implicit bias. So this actually fits really well. Implicit bias, if someone comes to you with this, it's such a misused fact. So there are facts that surround implicit bias. So if you put a brain scanner on somebody, say a white individual, and you flash faces in front of them, and some of them are happy, and some of them are angry, and some of them are sad. Different parts of the brain will fire up depending on the face that comes in front of them. And if you change the skin color, then sometimes not gonna say always because it's not always. Sometimes you get the different skin color causes those different centers to fire up, whether it's angry or sad or happy. And the initial studies on that showed that the typical white person watching the faces and they see white face, black face, white face, black face, it went happy center, mad center, happy center, mad center, or emotional center, fear center, or whatever. Uh, and they said, oh, see, people are implicitly biased to dislike other skin colors. Okay, so now we go into follow-up studies. And this is where sports come in. They put hats on people. And in the interviews, they had favorite sports teams, favorite baseball teams. And if the team is, so no matter what the color of the face, if the person was wearing the hat of the team you liked, the happy centers fired up. And if they were wearing your rival, the angry centers fired up. So yes, there is an initial response in most people, but it's so fickle that something as silly as someone who likes your sports team
Yeah.
is going to override it. And then they go back even further, like, oh, so we need to do these anti-racist trainings with 2-year-olds because they're implicitly biased. Because those same things happen. They flash faces and these centers of their brains fired up. But then the follow-up study, oh, let's compare male to female. Oh, male always fired up the bad side. The females always fired up. Oh, let's do hair color now with the females. Oh, surprise, surprise. The babies reacted positively to somebody that looked like their mother. And negatively to anybody who didn't look like their mother.
It's almost like we have a ingrained biological response to these things. But so let me give an analogy. I was watching a Clarkson's Farm on Amazon Prime because Jeremy Clarkson is hilarious, and I like watching him get hurt because it amuses me. But he had sheep that were ewing, and for anyone who's ever done 4-H or been around farming, you know that this happens. So sometimes a mother will give birth to a calf or a ewe or whatever, and either they can't nurse it because they've had too many, or maybe they reject it just because some animals are just crappy mothers, just like some humans. Well, so what you have to do is you have to take the afterbirth of a different mother and smear it all over the newborn. And then you go and put it in front of the surrogate mother so that it smells its own afterbirth and says, oh, you're my calf, you're my ewe, you're my whatever, so that it imprints on it. Because there are certain things that are hardwired into us. However, I will add to that, we are not calves, we are not ewes. We can be and are frequently shown to be more than our internal programming.
Yes and no, because the earlier the internal programming, the harder it is to overcome as you go through life.
Harder, yes, but
harder. Yeah, no, nothing is absolute.
Yes.
Nothing is absolute. So here's a good example, and this is the power of the mother. So when we talk about implicit bias, this is the power of the mother. There's a certain point in your infancy where it's kind of a mother is going to protect me bias you develop for everything that happens in that time. So if during that time someone abuses you in a certain way, say it sexually, someone abuses you sexually while you're so many months old to the end point, you're more likely to tolerate sexual abuse as an adult because your stress hormones have adapted to mother knows best. That's the power of the mother at that infant stage. So if you want to do a bias test to a 1.5, 2-year-old and flash faces that don't look like mommy, obviously mommy's going to respond best because mama knows best. You're still in that stage.
Because we're not that far removed from the environment constantly trying to kill us. These are necessary survival mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it's okay with mommy, it's okay for the rest of my life. And I say more likely because yes, we can overcome. Mm-hmm. You look at the big 5 personality traits. If you've listened to Jordan Peterson, he talks about them a lot. Yeah. Agreeableness, openness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and extroversion. So the big 5. The current research says about 60% of that is genetic, and then that 40% is nurture. So yes, there's room for improvement on everything, but at the same time, they say genetic, but we're probably going to say prenatal to genetic. Mm-hmm. So prenatal environment to genetic. So the changes along the way, we do have room for improvement on everything, but there is something to how we spend the very early days of our lives. And if you want to base political policy based on that, I mean, gosh, there's nothing I can do. It's
Mhm.
it's a rough deal. But going back to the sports teams, if this is one of my problems with the Kaepernick debate. No, it truly is. This is actually my main problem with the Kaepernick debate, because we are tribal individuals by nature. We are developed to be that way because it's survival. And when you come to modern society where we don't have to worry about the person coming onto our land and killing the babies and taking my wife and
Mhm.
trying to make their own babies and procreate, we've transcended that, but we still have that innate nature. So we have to have an outlet for it. And if we don't have an outlet for it, such as sports, which is since the Roman days, kind of our outlet for this tribalism, what's going to happen after that? People who are lacking that are going to move to something else. And that's my worry for the future here, because I personally think it's on purpose. I
Yes.
think the social justice movement went to sports to take that away from the non-social justice movement so that we get a backlash. Because now I can't watch football. I can't watch basketball. I can't watch baseball's kind of holding on, but it's kind of like
Yeah.
flip flopping back and forth. I mean, maybe I have to switch to hockey. I don't know,
I
but
should like hockey. I don't know why I don't like hockey. I mean, it's the
it's
kind of sport that should appeal to us, and yet I've never been able to watch it for very long.
well. So when you talk about liking sports, a lot of times this is where experience comes in. If you've
Mhm.
played it, you have a propensity to
Yeah.
understand it more and to be able to follow along a little
Yep.
better. Uh, so baseball, that's why I really don't care to watch it, because I've really never played it. I only watch my players that I train just because I support
Yeah.
them. Uh, but football, I mean, I loved football playing. It was one of my favorite things to do. Wrestling, I watched the national championships the other day. That was pretty
Mhm.
cool. Uh, all these things, you understand every little thing that's going on. It's more enjoyable for you.
Yeah.
But back to the tribalism. So part of this strategy, I think, long term, is to alienate people from that outlet of tribalism so they backlash into another form of tribalism.
One of my worries is whether they're doing this. You just made me think of something. I don't know if they're doing this purposefully or not, but
All the
but
actors are
another
not, but I think the people behind it are.
well, but another reason besides just the fact that I think a lot of people see everything through this colored lens of critical theory, but I worry that some of the really bad actors that are pushing things are purposely trying to co-opt things like sports because they already have an ingrained emotional response, right? And you can see this historically because you mentioned the outlet going back to Roman times. Things got really bad when that outlet was co-opted by the politicians.
Mhm.
So not just I mean people know the concept of bread and circuses. So that came about by Comatus was the one who really started that. I mean he was the one. For anyone who's seen the movie Gladiator, Commodus was Marcus Aurelius's son. And that was very loosely based on that. Commodus did, in fact, enter the arena on multiple occasions and fight as a gladiator. Um, and so bad things started to happen when they started to use that emotional fervor of the crowd and manipulate it towards political ends. One of the worst instances was actually in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. There were chariot racing teams that were like the precursor of the South American soccer riot. Literally, there was the politicians and the emperors would try and manipulate these fanatical fan clubs of the different chariot racing teams to further their political aims. And it was, I believe, Justinian the First in his reign where one of these riots got radically out of control and went on something like a 2 week spree where thousands of people were killed and gigantic chunks of ancient Constantinople were burnt to the ground because you're already in that uh, uh, you know tribal lizard brain non-thinking non-rational mode when you're talking about sports. And I think purposely we let ourselves loose because it's a safe space. So I don't need to have or I don't need to have as much control when I'm sparring with you as I do just on the street. I can't just, wail back and punch somebody on the street. There are consequences to that, but I can have release and I can let myself go mentally if we're putting on gloves and we're sparring,
Or
you
even
know,
better, if you're actually competing.
or if you're actually competing.
Yeah.
And then that even extends into, as we get older and we don't or can't compete as much, and so we put on the jersey or the hat of our favorite team, or we paint our chest in 0-degree weather in Lambeau Field, and we go a little nuts because we can, because as human beings we need these kinds of outlets. It's not that different to popcorn movies. People talking about how, yeah, I know this movie is crap, but I don't care because I can turn my brain off and I can have a little cathartic release. And I do think you're onto something there to worry about that cathartic release being co-opted by people with nefarious ends in mind.
Well, it's yeah, it's what you talked about, but it's the denial of that to another population, because
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
we all know that if you're denied some sort of your nature, there's going to be a downstream effect. Uh, in a happy marriage, if you're denied, say one person goes cold in bed, eventually either it's going to lead in some random secondary effect like alcoholism or gambling or some sort of release of those kind of base feelings, or it's going to lead to an affair, right? So we know downstream effects are happening, and sometimes I think in this situation, I think they want that downstream effect to happen,
Yeah.
especially given all the secondary indicators, such as the narrative of domestic terrorism being the greatest threat to
Yep.
the United States. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened to any degree in the last, since they've been talking about it for the last, when was Obama first president? 12, 13
Yeah.
years ago. It's
Yeah, a lot of people forget that this isn't new. This
yeah.
hysteria since January 6th. It's not new. They were talking about it when Obama was elected, that white nationalism and domestic terrorism.
Oh, the bill proposed is just an updated version
Uh-huh.
of the one that was proposed in 2015. So
Yep.
it's to get the right 2015,
Hmm.
14,
I
whatever.
think so.
Yeah. It's it, they've created, they're trying to create the situation that they've predicted.
Yeah.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
And whether they're doing it on purpose or not,
Little a,
they're
little b.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
pushing towards a point of no return. And I can't remember all the people I've heard talk about this, but I started hearing this from experts in psychology around 2016 or 2015. But I know Peterson has talked about it a number of times, which is that your marriage analogy, um, you can have a lot of damage to a marriage and still recover and still
Mhm.
heal that marriage. But numerous experts will tell you, like Peterson, that the point of no return is contempt.
Mhm.
That you can have all sorts of emotions towards your partner for whatever reason, because things have gone cold in bed, because somebody's drinking too much, whatever, those emotions can be overcome and there can be reconciliation unless there's contempt. And that's really what I see the critical theory people pushing, is to have contempt for the other side. That's part of the not acknowledging and not engaging with people who disagree with you. They want you to have contempt and to isolate and cut those people off.
Well, and from the right, you're getting contempt
Yes.
based for exactly the opposite reasons. It, it's blowing me away. I'm watching just the bicker back and forth, and
It's the danger of why I get really annoyed when I hear friends, family, or just generic people on the right call people who disagree with them traitors. That's contemptuous language, and you
Mhm.
need to be very careful with that, because traitor is something specific, just like racist is something specific, and you don't like it when somebody calls you a racist just for being white.
Well, and shoot, who did I hear? It was Dan Crenshaw talking about the Kaepernick situation, and he specifically stated it was absolutely completely a stupid error on the right to treat it as disrespect to veterans,
Mhm.
because it completely bypassed the issue, and it wasn't the intent, and it was exactly the same as the critical theorists applying intent to everything the right
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
And it should have been addressed on the merits. And, a lot of people have some problems with him for his lack of support for anti-red flagging and stuff, but he does think a little deeper than some of the right. So he's not quite
Yeah.
a rhino. Uh, but but yeah, it was pretty interesting to hear someone on the right say that,
Yeah.
because the initial response was, oh, it's anti-American, or it's anti-veteran, or it's anti this, and it's like, no, it's just not well thought out. Well, it was from their perspective,
Yes.
because they got exactly the response they wanted. Uh,
Mhm.
but it wasn't well thought out from the actual goal they say they intended to solve. It only created division,
Yes.
which is why I have a problem with it, because I have one. Kaepernick's not an idiot. To be an NFL quarterback, you cannot be stupid.
Mhm.
I don't care if
Well,
you're the worst quarterback in the NFL, you are not stupid.
and look at how he's banked, literally banked
Mhm.
this controversy to his. I mean, the report was that Nike deal he made was a $90 million deal.
Mhm.
He ain't
And
no
it
dummy.
was it was done before he kneeled.
Yeah.
That's the big part. So the biggest mistake people, so you gotta say, okay, are they stupid? Are they intentional? All these, every factor that it could be on their motives, and then eliminate. And I know he's not stupid,
Mhm.
or the people around him. I know they're not
For
stupid.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, speaking of racial division over nonsense, and potentially jumping the shark and causing more harm than good. One of the other things you wanted to talk about was Coleman Hughes interviewing Charles Murray, and
okay,
and
so I went down the rabbit hole. Yeah. No.
and
First of all, I want to commend. I know that they're too big and famous to hear my words, but I want to commend Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry, two what we call black intellectuals, uh, that disagree with the critical theories approach to everything.
Mhm.
Even though Glenn Lowry does give a good counterpoint to some of the things going on in the 90s and early 2000s, which everybody should listen to, because we should hear all sides of the story. And Not everything is born out of thin air. But they both interviewed Charles Murray. And if those who aren't familiar, Charles Murray did the what was it called?
The bell
The bell
curve,
curve. The bell curve.
1994-ish, I think is when it came out. And so he is persona non grata on the left. He is automatically a racist because of the bell curve.
Yeah, and I have a lot of thoughts on this because he just recently wrote another book, Facing Reality, on the situation. And it's kind of similar thoughts using the data from bell curve, which is, I think, a little bit disingenuous because that's 20 years old.
Yeah.
But at the same,
in his defense, he has written follow-ups on the
Yeah.
bell curve, addressing new things that have been learned since then.
and he did have some updated data to go with it as well. But one of the big no-no on all this is IQ. So when we look at any trait that is in organic systems or complex systems, most things are on a bell curve. I drew one for us on a previous one, but it goes like this, and you got the median in the middle, and then one standard, but let me go camera wise. One standard deviation, two standard deviations, and then the tails, and then the other way going negative. So if you take something like IQ, well, if we took all the population, IQ is set where 100 is the baseline. So it actually is a moving target. So your whole population, 100 would be standard. And then if you're one standard deviation away, you're about 135. And then further away, 150 or something like that, whatever. But you're increasing, but the population is decreasing. And so most of the people are going to be right there at the mean. And then 50% of the population is going to be on this side, and 50% is going to be on this side. And what he did was separated Caucasian IQ and Black IQ in his analysis. And what we had was the difference between the Caucasian IQ and the Black IQ at the time of his original publication of the bell curve was almost one standard deviation away. And then it improved to 0.85 from a standard deviation away. So the analysis was the mean Caucasian IQ was about 10 to 14 points higher than the mean Black IQ, which was obviously, if we don't have to state it, very controversial. So damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
IQ is a giant indicator in success in Western civilization. And well, there's a lot of problems with that. First, let me bring up something I brought up. One of my problems with it, I found this paper on socioeconomic status and IQ. This is something that wasn't very well accounted for in this analysis. And let me highlight the right part. High SES accounts for 65% of the standard deviation. So if you have a population that is typically lower SES, then we're skewing the data quite a bit. So that's the only reason I had this paper up. So that was one of my problems with that. Now it's still not the whole 85%, but at the same time, we've got a huge skew right there. And because we do know disproportionately African Americans are more poor than Caucasian Americans, well, there you go. There's at least part of it. That's at least to me. Now, if he has a rebuttal to that, I don't know about it, because I did all the searching I could, and all I could
Mhm.
find was reports on him being a white supremacist. But
Oh yeah, thanks Google. You're
so I
making
guess
it
I'm
very
gonna have to
helpful.
order. I'm gonna have to order the book and read it. But
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
Well, let's take a quick break and then because I found him, I think, more persuasive than you did. And I was more sympathetic to him. I understood where Coleman Hughes was coming from, but I was more sympathetic to Murray than
oh, I'm not.
or Murray's arguments than I think you were.
I'm not unsympathetic because he actually came across very well.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do have problems with his argument. But I also have a hypothetical to go into
Yeah.
with what if he's right?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
All right.
We'll be
We'll
back.
be right back.
Sorry for the hiccup. I don't have to apologize for the pause because we're not live. So I made me another martini. We took a bathroom break. And here we go. We're talking
As
about the
we're
bell
old.
curve. Yes.
Yes. All right. So where I found Murray persuasive, I listened to the Coleman Hughes podcast driving down back home this afternoon. So I just listened to it. And again, we really need to get the book and read it. But from what I understood, and where I've heard him talk about IQ generally before, is that his explanation was that we can, and he did in the data, control for as many environmental factors as we know how to control for, and with a large enough sample size that that difference is still there. And not just we're talking about black and white here because that's really the hot button issue, but there's a significant difference between whites and Asians as well.
Well, a good example he did bring up was Caucasian Europeans and Caucasian Jews, because there was even a more substantial difference
Yes.
between those than any others. So the Caucasian Jews were 10 to 15 IQ points higher than Caucasian Europeans. So, okay.
Well, so I understood where he's coming from, and I found and he kept trying to make the point that what he's trying to do is talk about what is based on the data he's looking at, that why it is much less important to him than simply acknowledging that this difference exists. Now,
And this is where I disagree with him, but keep going.
right. And so where I found it interesting is because Coleman Hughes is a very kind of soft-spoken, incredibly
Very stoic.
yes, stoic and deep thinking. One of the reasons I appreciate his podcast is because of the insights he has that lead to really good probing questions. But I wondered if this was an instance that was a little too personal. Because I can understand this because I feel like I have relatively thick skin in most instances, but I do know that I become a little unhinged if you insult my intelligence. You can disagree with me all you want, but don't insult my intelligence and pretend that I haven't thought deeply and researched vigorously on topics that I'm expounding on, especially if I'm giving you a lot of detail and a lot of insight. So I can understand how he would be reflexively contrary to Murray and asserting that I think there are much more to the environment than you're giving credit for.
Mhm.
So I can understand that, but one of my first thoughts as I was listening to him was to wonder, but would you feel the same way if it was a positive attribution? For instance, it's pretty well established statistically, and I know there have been some studies on this, but this is more in your wheelhouse, that there is a physiological difference between blacks and whites. just we mentioned you had the more up-to-date numbers that somewhere around 80% of the NBA is black. It's
Yeah, I
I think
brought
you said
those
it's
up. It
slightly,
was 78%
yeah, it's
or something
slightly
like
lower
that. Yeah.
now, thanks to all the boom
EuroLeague
in
stuff.
Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
But still, and it's pretty similar in the NFL. I think it's a little less in the NFL. I think it's 60 something now. But it's still a very high proportion, especially when you consider that only 13% of the total population is black. Um, Same thing in Major League Baseball. A lot of those black athletes are Caribbean, but still of the same ethnic background. And I know there have been some studies, I don't know how valid they are, that indicate a higher density of fast twitch fibers uh, in blacks versus whites. I don't know how many other studies there have been on physiological differences um, between the two races, but that would be a positive attribution of uh, difference in race. And I feel like
Here's one for you.
uh,
Penis size.
wasn't gonna go there, but you feel free. Feel free, my Polish friend. Feel free.
A lot of people of a certain persuasion would love to bring that up because they think it's true. But
Yeah. I thought you were actually going to go to something more empirical, which was squat depth. Um,
oh no,
because
we
there
could
is,
go there because we can go to Eastern Bloc versus
yeah,
Irish, both white, but Eastern
there
Bloc, Polish, Ukrainian, whatever can squat till till they touch their butt, and Irish get stuck about 90 degrees at best.
yeah,
So
Irish Northern Europeans, there is a physiological difference in pelvic
and for
structure.
those that don't know, that's how deep the femur goes into the hip
Mhm.
socket versus the other. Well, one allows a little bit more movement versus the
Right.
other that gets locked.
And and so I don't think it should be inherently verboten to talk about uh, cognitive differences in races. And it wouldn't be, it shouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that if we can observe physiological, then surely we can observe cognitive. That being said, where I thought they both kind of went off the rails, although Murray mentioned this briefly, is and to Coleman Hughes's point about, well, I don't think we should mainstream this idea because, how does that impact a young black kid who's going to think, well, what's the point because
Mhm.
I'm 10 to 15 points dumber than the white kid, or how's that going to impact the white kid even who thinks, well, I'm 10 to 15 points smarter than the black kid. And but then that's on the parent. Okay, in the same way that if you are a 5'10" pasty white corn husker who's obsessed with the NBA and that's your dream, okay, you need to realize the genetic deck is stacked against you. So you have no idea how far your effort can take you until you try, but you need to go into it with your eyes open that the genetic deck is stacked against you.
Well, I mean, Myers-Briggs tests. I think it's Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner talks about the multiple intelligences.
Mhm.
And there's the logical, there's the spatial, there's the emotional, all these different breakdowns. And IQ tests basically how quickly you assimilate and retain information. So that is one marker. And so maybe we just expand that to these other different realms. So that's one thing we could do with that. And we could test these uh, different kinds of intelligence. And then now you can find where you fit. So that's one solution to it because we are all a little bit different in how we spatially organize or logically process these things. And the quickness of assimilating information. Now, a good IQ test is very good at washing out education. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
it's how quickly did I give you new information and you did something with it.
Right. So if you went to a crappy school, or even if you went to a good school and had a crappy
Mhm.
teacher, a good IQ test should account for that. And that was another one that I listened to while I was driving. Was Peterson mentioned that with Michael Malice.
Mhm.
He talked briefly
Oh,
about IQ
that's a good
tests.
interview. Yeah.
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 But my point being that where I understand and think Murray's point has a lot of validity is the more data we have, the better choices we should be able to make, and the better um, effort we should be able to make towards our given goals. For instance, we're talking about IQ, cognitive ability here. If if your child is dyslexic or ADHD, that's something you want to know,
Mhm.
and not so you can say, well, kid, you're going to be a janitor. If he wants to work at NASA, more power to him, but you need to know that because the genetic deck is stacked against you, and these are obstacles you're going to have to overcome. So let's figure out how you overcome those obstacles.
Well, let's go back to episode 2 when we were talking about experts.
Mhm.
And one of the statements I made was, I believe high IQ people are wasted on specialization
Mhm.
because what you need for specialization is repetition. So if we have so this is where we're going to assume Charles Murray is right on everything. He's right on everything, and the bell curve is the mean is slightly to the left of Caucasians with Black Americans. So what do we need to encourage at that point? So this is the here and now. So we're going to talk about the future in a little bit. So this is the here and now. Here and now, well, maybe we should encourage specialization. We should encourage repetition. We should encourage practice. So if I want to be great at something, I need to do it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I got a personal example, which is actually perfect for social economic status. My wife and I have different IQs. Mine's somewhere about 148, 150 ish, and hers is in mid 130s. So, both technically on the high end of the spectrum, but hers is 15 points smaller than mine, which is exactly what we're talking about here, about a
Mhm.
10 to 15 point difference. Who makes more money?
That would be the MD.
That would be the MD because she had better study skills going into college. Repetition, 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 repetition. Study it, study it, study it, study it, which I sucked at that because in high school, everything was so easy that when I went to college, I had no clue how to study, how to do these things. So, okay, so we take the current generation. Well, what should we be focusing on now? If we do have this as knowledge, as something that is a fact, well, we should be encouraging these people to learn study skills. We should be encouraging them to use a skill that is very specialized and helps them be a productive member of society, right?
Mhm.
And then for future generations, well, now we go to evolutionary biology. How do we close the gap? According to
Yeah.
the interviews, Murray, this is where I disagree with Murray, is he was like, well, it's just the way it is. We're screwed. No. How do you close the gap? You selectively mate. So you encourage this
Giggity.
population to selectively mate for intelligence versus I'm bigger, stronger, faster, right? Of course,
Death
that's
by Shnu Shnu. Well, that's and I too thought that the conversation kind of went off the rails a little bit there, because I thought that's where Hughes was focusing too narrowly uh, uh, on Murray's assertion that the um, that the environmental gap had been closed as best it could, when it does need to be focused on. Because I agree with you that I think Murray to an extent, uh, and I understand where he's coming from. Of look, public policy wise, we've been focusing on closing the outcome gap for decades, and we've been flushing trillions of dollars down the toilet to do it. And we've gotten what was his point, that since about 1980-ish, the gap has stopped closing. So he made that point pretty particularly and repeatedly, that the gap has stopped closing. It was closing for a while through the 1900s, and then it stopped the late 70s, early 80s. But we've continued to flush trillions of dollars into the education system and other social programs to close this gap, and it's not closing. And so I sympathize with the idea that, okay, so why are we continuing to do this? Why are we continuing to spend trillions of dollars? Even if I disagree that the gap has closed as much as it's going to. But where I think I disagree most with Murray is his idea that if we face this reality, we can move on from this systemic racism nonsense and move towards doing something productive. Because I mean,
Well,
I don't,
and this is where I agree with you, but at the same time, Murray supplied zero answers to what was productive.
yes, yes, that was a problem, and that's where I would like to get into his book to see what he says, because I know in other of his books, he has offered such policy solutions. But from
So I haven't read the book. I'm going to be honest about that, but I did listen to Lowry interview him, which took a more analytical
uh,
kind of conversation, because he's an economist. So they talked a lot of numbers and equations and all these things. But then Lowry talking to McWhorter in their normal podcast, and McWhorter had exactly the same opinion that I had already come to, which is, yeah, he said this and this and this and this and this, but he offered nothing at the end of it. It was like this, I'm going to say all of these things, and then I'm going to leave it to the reader. Well, and when you leave it to the reader, well, most people are going to be like, well, either this is racist or this proves my point that I'm superior. And
the last 15-20 minutes of the Hughes interview, I think, makes clear why, is because he's frightfully concerned about the direction of the country and that we're headed towards a point of no return. So his primary
and just like we are, the backlash.
Yep.
Yeah.
So his primary point with the book was to say, look, this is what is. It's not systemic racism. Here are the numbers. Here are this history. Where I think he's pretty blind, though, is that, let's say that, and also where I think Coleman Hughes was very wrong here, is I don't think the concern with people accepting Murray's data, I don't think the problem is that well, then you'll have talking heads on the media on CNN. One of them will say systemic racism and the other will say inherent IQ differences, and that's going to be a problem. That's not the problem. The problem is that even if his data was accepted, the critical theorists would simply say that's another point of evidence for systemic racism, that in any inherent IQ differences, any gaps that have not been closed are just further proof that we're still a racist society. I mean, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they just have confirmation bias? That's what they do with everything else.
It's a surprising thing about Murray's work is I'm actually surprised they haven't embraced it. As well, because look at the basis of critical theories is we cannot live in the society because it's made for this population, and a great success marker in this culture is your IQ. So it is built for that, and we're built differently. So that is a sign of systemic racism, and I'm actually surprised it is not embraced. Which it might be at some point, especially since he came out with his new book. It's really fresh. So they'll change tactics however it fits their cause. So we'll see where it goes from here. But it was interesting to listen to him defend himself against two very critical people of his points. And I'm still with Hughes on the fact that we shouldn't be making it a mainstream topic because we it didn't get very well discussed in the Hughes interview, but in the Lowry interview where they discussed actually the mathematics behind the bell curves is you're going to alienate that portion of the bell curve that overlaps, the overlapping curves. And you're going to create the stereotype you have insisted on. So if you give a test, a math test to a person who is Asian, a female Asian, and you have her put her ethnicity on the first line, she scores about, so she puts Asian, whatever her is, Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever, on the first line, and then does the math test. She scores 10 points higher than if she doesn't have to do anything.
Yeah, this was astounding to me when we were talking about this before we started recording. I had not heard of this.
And you have a person of African descent, put African American, Black, whatever they identify as, on the first line, and they do the test, they score 10 points lower than if they take the test without doing anything else. Now you take that same Asian woman and you have her put Asian female on the math test, because typically, societally, females do worse at math. She will score 10 points lower. And so that identification, that stereotype bias actually plays into your own performance. And that in and of itself is enough for me to say this should not be one of the major talking points, because you can create a situation where a young Black kid could be taking a standardized test such as the ACT, SAT, or something like that, and say, I'm Black, I suck at math, and score a certain percentage lower on that same test just because of their mindset going into it. We do this with exercise. Your mindset going into a workout actually plays into the results. So if you're stressed and you're negative going into an exercise session, you could have a negative result even though you did the exact same work. So if we did this on a societal level, we're going to see, yeah, some people are going to transcend that, of course, but the mean is going to, again, be that bell curve. So in the middle is going to be people 10 points less. And so we say, oh, Black people score less on tests. Well, maybe it's because we're telling them Black people score less on tests. And if it's not the case right now, we can make it in the future. So now they're scoring 20 points less on tests.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, for anyone who doesn't know, overlapping bell curves, basically what we're talking about there is that just because the middle of the line says this for this group and the middle of the line says this for this group, I mean, you're talking about a total population. So that still means there are, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Black people who are smarter than millions of white people. And same thing when you talk about Asians, whose the middle of their line is higher still, et cetera, and so forth. And that's an important point because, again, what we're talking about here is ultimately, I feel, is potential. And that was my analogy with the 5'10" whitey living in the middle of rural Nebraska, whose dream is to be in the NBA. Go for it. Okay. Just understand the genetic deck is stacked against you. So what are you going to have to do to overcome that? In the same way of, I want to be a NASA engineer. Okay. Well, you're dyslexic. So what do we have to do to focus and work and overcome that, so that you can get so that you can have the study habits and get the kind of test scores you're going to need to achieve that. In the same way that where it was really frustrating, especially at the end of that Coleman Hughes Charles Murray interview, is because they kept circling around what was to me the key point of where what the focus of Murray's book I feel should have been, but I understand why it wasn't, and what I thought Coleman Hughes should have pushed a little harder on. One of Murray's problems is that he's a policy guy. So his academic work as a sociologist has been focused on um, uh, public policy outcomes and recommendations based on empirical data, and he's worked at a number of think tanks whose focus is the same thing of, you know, the impact of different public policies. So, you know, why some work, why some don't, and thus what we should do from a public policy standpoint. And he mentioned this, and I thought this is really where the conversation should have gone, is that, for instance, when it comes to an environmental factor of IQ, or at least of testing and test scores, there's a significant problem within especially urban Black communities of acting white. You don't want to stand out too much academically because you're acting white. And that's not a whitey saying that. There are, Shelby Steele's talked about that and written about that. Walter Williams has wrote about this ad nauseum, about problems in schools and how and why the public school system had failed the Black community. And from a public policy person's standpoint, the reason I think that should have been the focus is because this focus should have been, look, we've done all we can and more from a public policy standpoint. Now we need to focus on things that aren't public policy, things that are smaller in a sense, things that are community and culturally oriented in a sense.
I don't think they're smaller.
They're not.
I think they have the bigger impact, really.
Exactly. They far outweigh what their perceived impact is. The reason I call them smaller is because that's something we as individuals can focus on easier, because it's much easier to see and affect what's going on in your neighborhood or your school or your church than trying to get frickin' DC to change a law or a regulation. And yet that small area will have a much that small effort will have a much outsized impact over whatever. I mean, because Murray's right in that, and this is something that I thought he could have and should have brought up more while he and Hughes were talking about this, is it's not just the Black-white IQ gap has stopped closing. White test scores have stagnated as well. We've been dumping trillions of dollars into the public education system for the past 30 to 40 years, and we have stopped improving for the most part.
I'm going to say that's a skewed data point because, as I brought up earlier, IQ is relative to everybody taking the test.
Yeah. I conflated things there when I said IQ and test scores, and I should have.
Yeah.
I should have been more clear that from a test score perspective of giving, because IQ is cognitive ability rather than learned ability, and the data from test scores is what did you learn while you were in public school, and it's basically become crap all. And yet we've been dumping trillions of dollars into the public education system. So in that way, it has stagnated.
Yeah. We could go down so many different roads with that.
Right. But the point is, and Jason Whitlock has a new show on The Blaze, and it's on YouTube as well.
Don't tell me he's another person ruined by The Blaze.
No, he's not.
Because Dave Rubin was ruined by being on Blaze.
No, he's still him. He's still him.
And okay, because Rubin became he's I'm gonna call him a right-wing hack right now. And
I haven't watched him much, but that's simply for time issues. There are so many people I try and watch now that there are very few that I watch regularly anymore.
he was a lefty, and then he became
Mhm.
something in the middle, which I kind of identified with, and now
Yeah.
he's like he's talking points for the right
Well,
now.
the reason I've always loved Whitlock, besides just, I think, as a sports reporter, I've always appreciated his sports insights. Um, he is completely apolitical, unapologetically apolitical.
Mhm.
He says repeatedly, "I've never voted, and I don't plan on it." So when he starts talking about these kinds of issues, he doesn't give a crap about the policy side of it, which is what the uh, political debaters get hung up on too much. His concern is the cultural side of it, and I think that's where Murray's work really has a lot of value, but it's getting lost in this policy debate.
So if Murray's right, if Murray's correct on his analysis,
Mhm.
what's the fix? That's the big question. And in the long term, this is where I disagree with him. Is he thinks it's just the way it is. But would you say he was a sociologist?
Yeah, I believe that is his academic trade.
Yeah. And so if I'm going to go evolutionary biology, all we have to do is change the selection process. And this is where I don't agree with the social justice mindset of society is against us, so we have to change society. Is society might not be exactly for you, but you have to adjust yourself. And part of adjusting yourself is selecting for positive traits in that society. And if a positive trait in a certain society is IQ, well, maybe you should start selecting for the brainy person in the class. And you brought up acting white, being the nerd in the class or whatever. Well, maybe as a culture, whether it's music or TV or movies or whatever, we should be encouraging populations to select for the positive traits that benefit you in the society. Does that make sense?
And I'm a racist for my answer because my
Okay.
answer is uh, stop having single mother households.
Oh, no, we got to go down
Yeah,
that's something I had ready. So,
yeah. That is the single greatest predictor of all manner of social ills. But um,
well, because that plays to, okay, so let's go down the evolutionary biology, uh, behavioral psychology road. That plays to the tournament species, right? Because you're going out, you're highly sexual, you have a one night stand, you end up pregnant, and this dude moves on, right? So that's an extreme case, but that happens quite frequently. Uh, and there's a lot of in between. But again, we're talking on a bell curve. There's a whole slope that is devoted to what I just said.
mhm.
Uh, and that distribution is, are you attracted to the person? Did they dance with you well? Did they talk well? Uh, are they more imposing than the next guy? If there was an altercation, did they win the fight? Uh, so that plays to the tournament style, which is actually physically based, not intellectually based. And if that is a selection process in a certain demographic, whether it's just poor people, which I would actually love to study poor white people in this as well. If that's a selection process in just a certain demographic, then you are going to get a certain result. over the period of generations breeding. And so we have to address the situation that is created by that mindset. Now, on the other side, look at the thing. So we talk about prenatal environment. So we're going beyond genetics. We're going to prenatal environment. You got a single up and coming mother who's working 2 jobs. She's going to have a higher testosterone environment, and a higher testosterone baby, whether it's male or female, is going to have a different outcome than someone who is in a different environment. So you have a higher testosterone male who is in that environment. Do I go all the way down the rabbit hole on this one?
Oh, do it.
Go balls deep? Okay.
Yeah, because
So
it'll probably lend itself to what I was about to say. So go.
So we've got a male that provided his half of his 50% of his genes, who is a tournament style male who is not going to commit to any woman and just wants to spread his seed. We've got a female who is in a high testosterone environment, and probably a high testosterone female because she already went out and mated without any commitment to a relationship. And this is across all ethnicities. Okay. So, and this is more common in lower economic status areas. So we've got the selection process of getting this dude. We've got a person who is already higher in testosterone for a female than normal. We've got a high testosterone environment, prenatal environment. We produce a male that comes out, and so they've been through that whole environment. Now they're in a situation where they either have a single mother or a step parent, right? And I'm going to give away the answer by asking this question. What's the number one predictor of child abuse? By 100-fold, by the way.
I'm going to assume it's a step parent.
Step parent, yes. So we've got most likely child abuse on the way. And then we've got all of those factors contributing to higher aggression as they grow up. So now we've got a person who is born of all those other factors and then abused and is becoming an adolescent. They are going to be more aggressive, prone to addiction, prone to a higher crime environment, prone to be wanting to be accepted by other individuals. We've got a circular process that just keeps going and going.
Well,
and
what you've laid out there is the why, because the data is starkly clear that these things are true, whether you like it or not, for males raised by a single mother. Okay, what you've just explained is simply the psychological and physiological reasons for why all of these outcomes happen, and this is true across races. The Brookings Institute, which is a left-leaning think tank, has said for years and shown data that there are only 3 things you need to do in the United States to not be poor. The first one is to graduate high school, then hold down a full-time job and not have children until you are married. And then that will hold true generationally, because then that affects that child, that next generation. And that is true across races. What makes the black-white issue so problematic and so frightening and difficult as that the incredibly high percentage of Black children who are born into a single parent, usually single mother household. So the last I heard, it was some ludicrous number, like 70%.
Okay, 70% in total, 90% in urban areas.
Yeah, which consider flip that. In the 50s, it was 90 something percent 2-parent households, and in fact, Soul has written about how that in the 50s, the number of single parent white children was higher than black children. Uh, that makes a difference. And why I told you to keep going with the psychological and physiological aspects of this is because one of the reasons I brought up Whitlock is because he said something interesting I'd never thought of before. Which, first of all, as someone who is completely unapologetic in his opinions, he annoyingly says things that we're not allowed to, because we're not allowed to express opinions or even ask questions because of the pigment of our skin, whereas he can go balls out and he just doesn't freaking care.
All that.
Yeah, when it comes to uh, culture and neighborhoods, but also not just because of his pigment, but because that's his experience. He's speaking, anecdotally, but he's speaking from firsthand knowledge. This is the neighborhood and the culture he grew up in. But something that caught my attention and really made me think is that when he was talking about why young black men behave the way they do and why they have the statistical problems that they do when it comes to um, crime and poverty and not finishing their education and all that. He mentioned that you have all these young men being raised by women who are more emotional than men are. So you have these young men who aren't learning how to control their emotion the way a man has to in civilization. That they are too used to indulging in these emotions because that's all they get from their parent, from their caregiver. And I had never thought about that, but and you also brought up um, the evolutionary standpoint of nurture and of caregiving. We are complementary, and this is something that is destroyed by the battle of the sexes and third wave radical feminism. Men and women are complementary on purpose. Whether you believe that that was something that was created through generations of evolution or was purposefully created by a creator,
It's all
we
the
are
same.
yeah, the outcome is the same. We are complementary. We have to be for maximum development. Okay, you have women who are, generally speaking, more emotional, more attentive, better caregivers, but then you need men to instill a certain amount of drive and focus. I mean, that's one of the problems with men, is that we are sometimes too focused. We get blinders on, and our focus narrows. It's why we need women, because they help us with that. In fact, something I have thought for a long time is that, and this came about from a stupid history class I was in that was upper level stuff. So it was all history majors, and I'd made some offhand comments about if anyone knows who Dave Barry is, he's a humorist and a columnist, and he wrote a book, A History of the United States, called Dave Barry Slept Here. And he periodically throughout it would say, and women and minorities were making great contributions to society, as a snarky way to point out what history was becoming. And he wrote this in the late 90s of what history was becoming, that you had to and so I made a snarky comment about this, and some annoying lady said, well, I guess you don't know that women have children. I'm like, no, you're right, because my IQ is that of Jello. The reason men are the big characters of history is because men make the stuff of civilization, because that's who we are and what we do. But we wouldn't have civilization if we didn't have women, because women are the civilizing force behind civilization. Because the ultimate analogy for what men are in their natural state is the male lion. If we did not have that female to keep us in check, all we would do is sleep and eat and screw. But
Well,
everyone,
you go to the lion analogy, you wouldn't do that because eventually you would die.
no, but actually, that's the thing. The male lion is a big dumb sack of testosterone, and he doesn't care. I mean, that's all they will do, and that's why there is in every pack there is a female leader, and every once in a while the female leader will take charge, and she will call out to the male who's usually patrolling and literally rubbing his balls on everything so that he can mark his territory. And every once in a while, when the pack gets in trouble, the female lion will call out and say, "Hey, dummy, get over here. We need help." And the male's going to have to come running, or there will be consequences, because otherwise he's just going to sit out there and eat and sleep and screw.
I
And
mean,
and that has an impact on child rearing. Sticking with the animal analogy, you have to have uh, the female to give the example of what how a family unit is supposed to work. But then you have the male lion who's going to have that the rough play, as Peterson calls it, to show the younger males what it means to be the physical force behind the pack.
there is a lot to that. I'm going to say that that's about 50%. But there's a lot also to the things that develop aggression on the way up the chain.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I'm going to go ahead and jump a couple steps to my beef with CRT is it creates a situation of fear for a large part of young Black Americans' lives, and fear becomes anxiety, becomes aggression. It's all the same center of the brain, and that just keeps growing and growing and growing depending on the stimulus it gets. So uh, it's it's a physiological change through the nurture they receive on the way up. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But single parent household creates a situation where you're looking to everything outside of your paternal influence. So if you're doing that, then you're reading Ibram X. Kendi. If you're doing that, then you're watching TV. If you're doing that, then you're hanging out with your boys in the hood. You know, all these different factors that can fill up your time. So all of these things can lead to, again, alternative lifestyles like drug running, gang lifestyle, seeking family, seeking male influence, or just being bitter. So I think all of these things play into the whole role all the way up. But if you, it's just one of the factors that I think leads to male aggression in a certain demographic.
Mm-hmm.
And male aggression leads to crime, leads to incarceration rates, leads to all the things that we're dealing with as proof of systemic racism.
Well, what I was thinking with the analogy, and what immediately jumped into my head when Jason Whitlock talked about the emotional upbringing of a young Black man being raised by a single mother, is Peterson has taken a lot of heat for simply speaking the truth, the fact that behind every male interaction is a threat of violence, and it's subconscious, unspoken, almost all the time, but it's there. It's when you tell your, you know, rebellious teenage son, get your butt out there and mow the lawn. You don't have to say or else. It's there. And understanding that there are times when you have to do what you don't want to do, or there will be consequences, is a major part of stopping being a child and becoming an adult, especially for a male. But also simply the example, the unspoken example of how to use that inherent physical presence and inherent physical power of a male of the species without unleashing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The old, it's not to not be a dangerous person, but to be a dangerous person and not use it.
Mhm.
That's pretty close to the quote from Peterson, I think. Uh, well, that's an age old question because uh, people try to overemphasize things like passiveness and peace, uh, lack of aggression, when it's really more of a situation of when do I use it and how do I use it. And there is a time to be, oh, if someone attacks my sister, for example, and I decide to be passive, what kind of man am I?
Yeah.
I mean, really, if someone breaks into my house and has a gun and I do nothing, what kind of man am I? What kind of person am I? Really, a mother should react at that point.
Mhm.
So when do we use our aggression? When do we not? And how do we control it when we do use it?
Yeah. I think we've ranted about this before, but when we were in elementary school, if we got in a fight and got dragged in front of the teacher, the principal, or whatever, and pretty much the first thing you're asked is who started it. Somewhere along the line, somewhere not long after we were in elementary school, unfortunately, uh, it became zero tolerance and it didn't matter, which is disastrous, I think, culturally, because who started it matters.
Who started does matter, because if someone comes up and punches me in the face
Mhm.
and I at that point, if I don't even fight back, if I just put my hands up, you're still part of the process.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was part of the flipping of how everything went.
Yep.
Jonathan Haidt in The Coddling of American Mind put the timeline together, and in the 90s we started having the helicopter parent. You know, it's not uh, the kid figuring out that falling off the monkey bars hurt you, so you don't do the same stupid thing you were doing on the monkey bars before,
Yeah.
versus, oh God, monkey bars are dangerous because my kid got hurt, we have to have them removed from the playground.
Yeah.
And then that
Or you
extended.
put 2 feet of padding underneath it so that you don't feel anything when you
Yeah,
fall off.
exactly. So it was the idea of, can my kid get hurt but not die, versus can
We
my
had
kid,
gravel under our monkey bars.
yeah, can my kid not get hurt, versus, oh, something somebody said hurts me, or oh, the idea of somebody hurts me, and now where were we at? So speaking of Peterson, sidebar, have you ever watched the Peterson interviewing Milo Yiannopoulos?
No, I've been meaning to, because I didn't even realize he'd done it. And then I'd heard him mention it a couple of times, or someone he was talking to mention it a couple of times in podcasts that I've listened to lately. I said, really? I gotta check that out.
Yeah, you want to talk about a third rail, interview Milo. And it's actually, I was apprehensive going into it because Milo turns me off in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he psychoanalyzes them on in real time, and it's pretty freaking crazy going through it all. Uh, but then I've been a bunch of people have been interviewing uh, Alex Jones lately.
Ugh. I don't believe in deplatforming, but personally, I find it rather repugnant when people give him, I almost hate to use this word, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. I hate it when people give him platform. See, now I use that word very specifically. When someone like Coleman Hughes and Charles Murray talked about this, is that he's undoubtedly going to get, or has gotten, because this was like the beginning of this month, I think, when this podcast came out. But he's going to get blowback for giving Murray, who's obviously a racist, a platform. And when the cancel culture people say that, they just mean are heard. If somebody is heard, then it's terrible. Megyn Kelly did an interview right after she got her NBC short-lived NBC show. People lost their minds because the first interview she did was Alex Jones. Well, she pushed him hard on some really key things where he needed to be pushed on, like his freaking the most detestable thing to me is when he said that the Sandy Hook massacre of those children was a false flag, and the parents were crisis actors. You're a repugnant human being. And people, so I like Steven Crowder because he makes me laugh, but he's had Alex Jones on a number of times, and I refuse to watch those shows because he's playing with him. He's having fun with him. He's doing a bit, basically. No, if you're going to have someone like that on, then you better push them hard on the repugnant things they have said.
Yeah. So the people I watch do that. Viva Barnes, the lead, the law team.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Viva Fry and Robert Barnes, they had him on. Who else did I watch?
Now that's not to say I don't disagree with the people who point out that you can draw a straight line from when Alex Jones got yanked off of YouTube and the social media platforms to all the other nonsense that has been happening and the banning that has been happening since. I don't care how repugnant you are. If you're not breaking a law, you shouldn't be yanked off of these platforms unless these people are openly admitting, which I think they are, that they're publishers, not providers.
Mm-hmm. Well, now they're government agencies.
Exactly. And he was an easy target because, as I say, he's a repugnant individual. Mm-hmm. So nobody's going to stand up for him because why would you? I don't want to get tarnished with that.
You do know there's a lawsuit between him and Megyn Kelly, right?
Oh,
yeah, because they edited the video and the audio to make him look worse. So
well, that's dumb. You don't need to edit him to make him look worse. Just
exactly. Yeah, but it's
let him talk.
It's apparently true, and so that's all going down. But
it's so frustrating. What? Don't do that, people. Just get people like that. Just need rope. Why do you have to make it worse by making yourself by sinking to that level?
Well, everybody thought that about the first presidential debate. Trump, just let Biden talk.
Yeah.
Just let him talk. Quit interrupting. But yeah, it's one of those things that you're like, well, is my opinion about exactly what the person said or what people have presented about what he said? And so I'm using him as an extreme example because he's an extreme person. Yeah. He's a very extreme person. And why did she have to misrepresent him? Which I actually liked her in a lot of other interviews. She's the only person that held Sam Harris to the fire with his support of Biden because he didn't have a good answer.
Yeah.
You know, so you respect her in that degree, but then at the same point, you see somebody like that. It was like, okay, well, he could have just talked himself into a hole. But you forced the issue by editing his statements and baiting him into an interview that wasn't what you initially represented it to be. So this all goes back to the representation of everything that we're doing. So I don't know.
We're all doomed.
We're all doomed. No, we're not all doomed. I actually think we're going to a positive swing in all this. Because
See, that's why you're here, because I can see how we could be, but I just don't have the optimism and the faith to think we actually will.
uh people have played their hand, man.
Hmm.
And if somebody's bluffing, you don't know. But if somebody gives you that tell, then you know when to hold, when to fold, and everything. And I think we're on a positive swing. We've got people like Manchin who are holding up, who have kind of held the fort for real liberalism on the left. And then we got a few on the right that are kind of responding correctly. And then just the general consensus of, wow, this was crazier than I thought it was. And we don't want to go there, even despite all the brainwashing. I think the pandemic accelerated things too fast, even though it did prove a lot of points right with how we can control people. But
Well, I hope you're right. In the meantime, that seems like a good place to stop. So I can go to bed, so that I can go pick some peaches, so that I can come down there and we can make some brandy.
ooh, that sounds like great. No, we're not going to make brandy because that would be illegal. We're going to make peach wine, and then maybe put
Very
some
well.
fire under it,
Why is making brandy illegal?
because you have to distill it, and it's a fire hazard.
Well, then so is making brisket.
Or frying a turkey, which burns more houses down than anything else. But no, this is one of the. I'm telling you,
Oh,
this is where us liberals fight with you conservatives. If it has alcohol in the label, they say, "Oh, any excuse will do." Can I tell you a story?
yes, please. Story time with Samo.
Yeah. So this guy went to his neighbor and he said, "Hey, I need to borrow your lawnmower. Can I borrow it?" And the neighbor says, "No, you can't, because my wife's making pork chops." He said, "What the hell does your wife making pork chops have anything to do with me borrowing your lawnmower?" He said, "If I don't want you to borrow my lawnmower, any excuse will do." That's what it is with alcohol laws. If I don't want you to drink, or I don't want you to make alcohol, any excuse will do.
Well, that's what we should talk about next time, because I have an analogy that involves grizzly bears killing people.
Well, I thought we were going to talk sexuality,
Oh, you talk sexuality.
because I know that's where we're going to fight. And okay, so a
Mhm,
Facebook
mhm.
post on one of our episodes, episode 3, which is where we talk Kaepernick.
Uh-huh.
So a guy commented on it from our old high school about how there was a lack of diversity and something about your fingernails. And yeah, they weren't groomed very well, apparently, in episode 3. And
Well, I'm sorry for working in the garden and digging in the dirt like a human being.
how him and one other person are the only sane people from our class of 98.
Oh, don't
And
make me go back on Facebook. I hate that place.
I do need to respond to it. I want to respond respectfully. So I've been thinking really hard about it, even though it's quite about a week and a half since he did put his thing on there.
Okay.
I'm not much of a social media responder, so I guess I have to get better at that. But I
All
also
right.
am precise in my speech. So,
Well, then I guess next time we will talk about bears of a different sort.
but the main thing was diversity of thought, and I was like, well, episode 3 was the Kaepernick thing, which we actually agree on. So that's a bad sample. Go to our abortion debate or something like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
and
Oy.
yeah, the
Oy vey.
sexuality debate's probably going to be a
Oh,
little.
that's right, because I was listening to Chatting with Candace. That's where that came from.
Yeah, and
Okay,
uh, something about meat popsicles or something.
right. All right. So go Go check out Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry for this one. And for next time, go check out the MILF-tastic chatting with Candace. Is that not an accurate description? Was I?
Otherwise known as Evolovia, if you want to go to Pornhub and check it out. I don't know. Who knows? 10:23 this evening. I'm going to start uploading this, so it'll be tomorrow.
We'll see if there's a spike on the search terms.
Yes. I'm just going to put it in the description. Evolovia.
It's not clickbait at all.
Not clickbait at all. Yes.
All right, people, go away.
Later. Oh, that was interesting. Didn't get everything I wanted, but
Oh no, we meandered quite a bit, but I guess that happens
shit.
when
hold on. It still says it's recording.